Good afternoon, good morning to those of you who are on the East Coast of the United States, and welcome to everybody here in London. I'm Leslie Vinjamori at Chatham House. I direct the US and Americas program here, and I am delighted to welcome two very distinguished speakers today to talk about what I think is one of the most front of mind questions that many people clearly across the United States, but especially here in the United Kingdom for us and across Europe have since January 20th, when Donald Trump became president again, and the rush of executive orders and policies, many of which have been very disruptive, unconventional, and pushing at many, I think, of people's dominant assumptions about America's engagement over the course of the last 7 or 8 decades, have raised a lot of questions, and anecdotally we are hearing people say that perhaps the thing that's going to change America and move it back to what many people think is a normal way of engaging both at home and beyond its borders is the robustness of the US domestic, legal, economic, and political system. And so we thought, in light of the sort of notion that many people think the markets will constrain the US president to the extent that that's important or necessary, or that the courts will, or that civil society engagement will, that it would be difficult to imagine two better scholars, policy analysts, leading thinkers, well-published individuals to contribute to this conversation than Dr. Adam Posen and my dear friend, Professor David Cole. Both of these individuals, I'm sure, are very well known to you for their writing and their broader public engagement, but let me just say a very brief word about each one of them. Since we only have an hour, we'll launch very quickly into the conversation. Dr. Posen is president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He's been there since 2013. But I did want to mention your UK credentials. I was rereading your bio, and I had not remembered that you were an external voting member of the UK's Monetary Policy Committee. Yep. You've also been recognized for your service by then Her Majesty's government, and have contributed in multiple ways throughout your career. So thank you very much for joining us. You've also attended one of our recent Chatham House dinners in I believe, Washington, D.C., and made a tremendous contribution, or was it New York City? Thank you. Professor David Cole, if you don't read the New York Review of Books, this is the time to start. His writings over a very long period of time have been the most illuminating and informative of any constitutional legal scholar in the United States on the most pressing questions of our time, the role of the courts, the role of civil society, taking what I feel is a very measured and very rigorous and serious approach. You are the Honorable George Mitchell Professor in Law and Public Policy at Georgetown, where you've spent most of your career. But obviously, for our audience, it's especially important to know that you were the National Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union. You worked in that role during the entire first Trump administration and continued on until very recently. And I know that as part of your role, you thought very, very seriously in a very rigorous way about when and how to pursue a legal strategy across the whole of the United States to ensure that the rule of law and the constitutional rule of law was upheld. So again, two tremendous people to really help us get below the headline on what is a very urgent, but also medium and long-term conversation about the robustness of the US system. Will the system work in a context where the executive authority, not only of this president, but of past US presidents, especially on matters of foreign policy, has continued to grow over time? We're moving well beyond foreign policy to look at the economic and legal context, but nonetheless. Adam, can I turn to you first to give us some scene-setting comments on where Donald Trump is taking America's economic policy, and to really answer that question, will the markets be the constraint that so many people assume that it will be? Should the president's economic policy push us into an inflationary period or any other sort of directions that perhaps need, a level of measure introduced?
Thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you for the generous introduction, and thanks to the Chatham House for having me virtually back. Let me start by just pointing out some facts from the economist's point of view. I'm not a lawyer. I'm certainly not a distinguished lawyer like David, but in some sense that may be a useful counterpoint because I tend to be more cynical and empirical about the courts than idealistic. And what we have seen basically since the Bush-Cheney presidency in 2000 under both parties is increasing use of executive orders and increasing passivity by Congress in a whole host of areas, but especially in the area of trade policy, sanctions policy, foreign investment policy. And what we've seen from President Trump over the last however many weeks and years it feels like, is an extreme expansion of that, not in literal count of executive orders, although those are higher, but importantly in terms of breaking down norms and established patterns. My colleague, Mary Lovely at Peterson, had a nice piece about this in the New York Times a week or two ago. The main point is there's been two fundamental changes in the approach to trade policy. First is that there are being linkages across issues to fentanyl distribution, to migration issues, to security issues. And while there's always been in the background some of that, there's been intentional, deliberate legal barriers and organizational barriers to try to keep trade somewhat separated. The second piece of it is that in general, since World War II, across, again, both parties, the norm has been that Congress pushes in a protectionist direction and a bullying direction, but the president and the executive branch tend to be a counterweight and try to live up to the US's international obligations or treaty commitments or so on. And in this administration, that eroded a little bit under Biden, no question, but it has massively changed. And so because of those two changes, we have a very unprecedented, I would say, aggressive use of trade policy bilaterally in disregard of the WTO, in disregard of basic notions that you have what's called most favored nation status, that you have a whole bunch of countries that you treat the same for trade purposes with only specific deviations. And in particular, as we've seen in Trump's approach to Canada and Mexico, very big linkages from trade issues to other issues, directly quid pro quo. And underlying all this, and David and you may want to talk about this in other contexts, but underlying all this is, again, a passivity of Congress. So under Trump 1, under Biden, and now under Trump 2, there are provisions in the authorities that the president is fig leaf using to cover his actions, where Congress has the right to review or even the obligation to review, or a certain timeline, depending on the act, by which Congress has to say whether the tariffs or the threats are allowed to continue. And through the last 9 years, Congress has refused to do that. They've just left in place things that is totally within their authority to, in fact, legally, you could argue, as from my understanding from my law colleagues, you could argue Congress is failing to live up to the law because they're supposed to ratify or renew or authorize these acts. Now, this is obviously having huge foreign policy implications and implications to the international system, and reinforces the actions that I know Chatham House has spoken about over the last few weeks vis-a-vis NATO and Europe. Let me make two other points and then turn it over to David. The first is, it's not just trade. Again, under Trump, under Biden, Trump 1 on Biden, but now again escalating potentially, is the use of extraterritorial sanctions, meaning that the US decides not just we're going to get agreement with a bunch of countries on a specific set of sanctions, say versus Iran on their nuclear program. Instead, it's the US says, we're going to put sanctions on Russia, but we're also going to punish the companies or the governments of even allied countries if they deviate from our line on sanctions. And the legality of this is in question, but even more so from an economics point of view, the effectiveness of this is in question. Temporarily, you can say, convince a Chinese company, no, don't supply X to Russia, or convince a Dutch or Taiwanese semiconductor company, don't provide X to China. But over time, that just induces people to build systems around and get out from under the US. And so there's always a trade-off. Do you overdo this? Do you use the threat too often? Do you overdo rather than at least trying to get agreement before just imposing it? And so this is analogous into some of the things on the trade front that the Trump team is using, things that they don't even call sanctions, but effectively are sanctions in a relatively aggressive executive authority way. And again, this is area, it's a little less explicit, but where historically Congress would be involved. You then have a whole set of issues with independent agencies like the Federal Reserve, the various financial regulators, the International Trade Commission, things like that. David can talk about the more general issue of that. The final thing I want to note is fiscal policy, which of course is the big ticket item, as anyone living in the UK right now knows, or who lived through Liz Truss a couple of years ago knows. So the question is the US government going to neglect fiscal policy, go very arbitrary, executive-led fiscal policy, and what are the implications? Now, we've just had a budget, first step in the budget process, passed the US House of Representatives yesterday. It passed on a straight party line vote. It passed by a very narrow majority, but it passed. Ironically, the Trump administration had been preparing all kinds of, let's say, controversial, questionable constitutional measures to withhold spending that was authorized by Congress, to get around the Congress for budget purposes on the assumption that the House might be held by the Democrats. And so ironically, because the House is held by the Republicans, there's actually been less executive usurpation or contesting of the budget process because they're letting the Republicans carry it through. And so in a sense, that's good. But they're still doing exactly what the president wants, which again, they're legally entitled to, and that's what normally happens in the first year of a presidential term. But just to say one needs to watch this space, and obviously some of the Doge, or whatever you call it, chainsaw measures by Elon Musk's team in terms of dealing with congressionally appropriated funds, congressionally supported programs, explicitly legislative programs, and just taking them out is very extreme and new. If I could, in the interest of time, let me postpone coming back to the markets question, whether there'll be a discipline.
I was actually going to ask you the markets question, but we'll come back to that after David. I think it's one that's, I'm sure, hard to evaluate.
Oh, it's important. I just didn't want to go on too long. Sorry.
We'll come back to that after David, but I want to be sure that we definitely do come back to that because it's so important. Thank you for your remarks. David, you think about the courts not only at all levels, and you have a better understanding of this than probably anybody that we've talked to, certainly, and anybody in the US. So we look forward to hearing your thoughts on this.
Sure. And thanks again for having me. Thanks to all of you who are joining on this webinar. So, you know, I actually joined the American Civil Liberties Union as the National Legal Director about 10 days before Trump took office the first time around. In that 4-year period, we filed over 400 legal actions against the president. The president had the worst won-lost record in the Supreme Court of any president since the early term of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when you had a very, very conservative court striking down laws that were seeking to protect consumers and workers in the early the early 20th century. But and I think we're going to see something quite similar this time around. Yes, he's issued a lot of executive orders. Yes, he's broken every norm that one can name, but there's been a lot of pushback, and that pushback has come from a variety of places. It's come from civil society groups filing lawsuits. It's come from unions representing workers who are being laid off. It has come from state attorneys general. So we have every state has their own attorney general, and the blue state attorney generals have filed many lawsuits challenging the legality of his actions. It's come from within the executive branch. Recently, we saw resignations in New York of 2 top prosecutors over his decision to basically shelve the prosecution of the corruption prosecution of Eric Adams in a quid pro quo for Eric Adams helping him on immigration. These were prosecutors, one of whom was appointed by Trump. One of them clerked for Justice Scalia, the other clerked for Justice Roberts. They are no liberals, and they stepped down rather than do his bidding. And we've seen a number of resignations across the executive branch. So there has been a lot of pushback. You haven't seen the kind of protests in the streets that we saw with the Women's March, the largest march in world history, I think. But I think you are seeing increasing concern and a lot of more strategic pushback. The courts have enjoined a lot of what he's done. So they've enjoined a lot of his efforts to freeze funding and not pay off on contracts, USAID and others. They have enjoined his firing of inspectors general. They have enjoined his effort to try to take away birthright citizenship, a constitutional right under the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. They have enjoined some of his anti-trans measures. They have enjoined his anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion measures. And we're still at the lower court level on these. There will be appeals. Ultimately, it's going to go to the Supreme Court, and that's going to be the true test. But already, and a lot of people say, he controls the courts. He appointed so many judges and justices last time around. He did appoint a lot of justices. He appointed 3 justices, so it's a 6 Republican appointee, 3 Democratic appointee Supreme Court. He appointed a lot of lower court judges, about 25% of the judiciary he appointed, but about 65% of the judiciary were appointed by Obama and Biden. So in the lower courts, you've got a 2/3, 1/3 chance of getting a judge who was appointed by a Democrat. And in the Supreme Court, it's the other way around. But already, the 2 signs we've had thus far from the Supreme Court. Trump asked right before he was inaugurated to bar the New York court from sentencing him, and they rejected that by a vote of 5-4. Similarly, just now there was an effort to overturn a lower court injunction against the firing of an inspector general in charge of protecting whistleblowers, and the court rejected that request 5-4. And I don't think, I think on the court there are the 6 are quite conservative, but they vary in how conservative they are. I think Justice Alito and Justice Thomas are kind of, they may well be happy with a lot of what's going on. I don't think any of the other justices among the conservatives are really happy with what's going on with respect to President Trump. Does that mean they'll invalidate everything he does? No. Does that mean we can, rely on the courts to save us? No. But I think they will play an important role, as they did last time, and will check many of the things that he does if, and this is the key, right? If citizens engage, if there's civil society resistance. But I think we're already seeing it. and I think it will only grow as his actions start to have real world effects on people that make them pissed off.
I'm going to follow up with you first, David, because you put so many things out there. You wrote a very important book several years ago. I think it was before you went into your role at the ACLU. And one of the things that you said in your book was that the courts are looking, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the courts sort of take the temperature. What are the parameters? What are the boundaries within which they can push their decisions? They look at civil society. So they look, as you've just said, to civic engagement. They look at protests, that this isn't, courts who are sort of operating behind a veil of ignorance or behind a black curtain or anything else. And, one of the first things you said is there aren't protests. And I guess, could you flesh this out a little bit? Is it that, for the most part, yes, people might be a little bit concerned about certain things, but more or less, people are more or less on board, or the issues that are, being tackled are not getting at organized constituencies that are going to mobilize against them? Are people concerned and afraid to protest? Is this why we're not seeing protests? Or is there a sort of normalization of the moment that we're in? And do you expect to see a different kind of civic engagement than we're seeing right now, as you think?
So I think so first, the book is called Engines of Liberty, and it's about how constitutional change happens. And the argument is that it's not driven only by clever arguments made by clever lawyers in court, that you need that. But that's not sufficient. You also need a movement. You need a civil society movement. So, how does marriage equality become constitutionally protected? How does the right to bear arms become constitutionally protected? When you actually look at what led to those decisions from the Supreme Court, it is the actions of gay rights groups. It is the actions of the National Rifle Association in a variety of different forums, kind of basically laying the ground for decision by the Supreme Court. And I don't think the Supreme Court goes out in there and puts its finger up and tries to determine what way the wind blows. It's applying law, but the legal principles it's applying are often quite open-ended, and they have to be concerned about their legitimacy and about sort of how the public responds to them, because that's, at the end of the day, their only power is their legitimacy. If they lose their legitimacy, they have no ability to call out the troops. And historians who have looked at the court have found that the Supreme Court rarely departs very much from where the kind of mainstream of American society is on fundamental constitutional values. And when it does, there's a lot of pushback and corrects itself. So that's one. In terms of, I don't think it's just protests. We've lost Leslie, but I know she's coming back. She's having some internet problems, but she said she'd be back. So I'll filibuster. But I think it's not so much that they're looking at whether there are protests. It's more they think about how their decisions are likely to be viewed by various audiences, audiences of their lawyer friends, audiences within the academy, audiences who watch television news, read the newspapers, etc. Those are all important audiences, and they do have to think about that, even though they're not, again, just doing what the country wants them to do. And I think Trump is going way out, ahead of his skis in terms of the things that he is doing. He did not have anything like a mandate to undertake the kinds of radical things that he's done. And he won by a bare majority. He won largely because about 19 million people who came out and voted for Joe Biden the last time around did not vote for Kamala Harris. It's not that they voted for Trump, they just didn't vote. And so you had essentially Trump getting about the same number of votes as last time around, and Kamala Harris getting substantially fewer votes than Joe Biden got. So, and even so, it was it was not a landslide. So I think, and polls are already suggesting that there's a lot of unhappiness with what he is doing. These are not the things that they expect. What they want are fix the economy, fix inflation, give us meaningful work and jobs. And what he's doing is instead, he hasn't done anything to do that. He's instead scapegoating. Wherever he can, he scapegoats, and he scapegoats vulnerable groups. So he scapegoats immigrants, he scapegoats transgender folks, he scapegoats DEI, rather than doing something that would actually affect people's well-being. It's culture wars to try to deflect from the fact that he doesn't have a program that's actually going to help people in the real world. And so over time, I think, he will be weakened just as he was the last time around. You have to remember, last time around, he came in, all gung-ho, and by the time he left, he was, run out of town, totally ashamed, down at Mar-a-Lago. Nobody wanted to talk to him, etc. Somehow he managed to come back from all that, but that just shows how things can change very quickly. And I think I'm optimistic they will change here as well.
Can I ask you one more question before we come to you, Adam, on the markets? I hope I didn't miss a markets intervention in the moment of an internet crisis. David, we're only a month or so into this administration, but can you look back as well as look forward? If you take a look at the 4 years in which President Biden was in office, and was there a moment, right? Just because I think sometimes we're trying very hard not to assume things. We're only a few weeks into the Trump administration. How many moments did you have, or is there one particular moment that stands out when you felt like the executive authority of President Biden had reached beyond what was legitimate, and that the courts played a very important role in constraining that authority?
So, Adam mentioned this earlier. Congress is passive. I would say that's a nice way of putting it. Congress is dysfunctional, and it's dysfunctional because of the incredible partisan divide in this country, because of gerrymandering, because of the fact that people move to places where their friends are. And so members of Congress mostly only have to worry about a primary election. They only have to worry about not getting outflanked by their own party. They don't have to worry about, the general election where they're running against the other party, because in most places if they win the primary, they win the general election. And then it's basically 50-50 divide. And so nothing gets done. Congress can't do anything when it's a 50-50 divide. You need essentially a supermajority to pass any legislation through the Senate because of a rule called the filibuster, which requires 60 votes if anyone objects. So as a result, under Trump the first time around, under Biden this time around, under Obama as well, Congress is can't really do very much, and as a result, you have more and more government by executive order. And the court has put some constraints on that. It has said you got to have clear authorization from a statute before you can do something big and new and different. And it was on that ground that it struck down Biden's efforts to do some environmental reform, to provide college, to forgive student loans and the like. So, it has, the courts played some role there, and it may well play a similar role this time around. But it's not so much a feature of Trump, it's a feature of our dysfunctional constitutional system in a world of deep partisan divide.
Thank you. And one final question, and then over to you, Adam, on the markets.
Why don't
question,
you just skip me, Leslie? You'd much rather talk to David.
No, definitely not, because this is going to feed right into what I want to ask you about the markets. So if we come to this month of President Trump, and I guess it is a question for both of you, what has jumped out as you being beyond the what one moment has jumped out at you as being beyond the moment where you feel like either the markets or the courts or some other mechanism should have kicked into place, and has it kicked into place, or are we seeing a different kind of politics right now? Adam, actually, let's come to you first on that question.
I don't think of it in terms of moments. I think what there has been is a total disregard for previous commitments across a broad range of policies. So the basically treatment of China and Mexico completely disregards the USMCA trade agreement, which Trump himself renegotiated and had passed years ago. We've seen the total disregard for whether countries are allies or not in the treatment of their steel and other heavy industries. And it is literally in legislation that Canada and some other places are, if they're allies, are to be treated as part of the US industrial base, which makes sense. And Trump has disregarded that. So I view it as more a pattern of not just abstract norms or specific shocking excesses, but abrogating very long-standing agreements which Trump himself and previous presidents made. And that's extraordinary.
Can you also follow up with a comment on whether you wrote some a very powerful piece about President Trump's planned economic policy that was published before he came into office, I believe. And you talked about the likely inflationary impacts. Could you say a little bit about whether, what your view is? I know it's hard to measure because we're not there,
right?
But your view is on the likely market impact.
Yeah, thank you for bringing it back to that, Leslie. I think what's important to understand is that the bond market impact, essentially interest rates and to some degree the currency, is a much more powerful check than the stock market. Even though people often tend to talk about the stock market, and that's as mattering more to Trump, and I think it does, but that's for two reasons. First is the stock market fluctuates for a much wider variety of reasons, which doesn't necessarily have anything to do over any period directly with policies. The second is a number of the policies we're undertaking under the Trump administration, as David has discussed and implied, can end up being very favorable for companies that are listed on the stock market, whether it's tax policy, whether it's Elon Musk getting to get government contracts with minimal scrutiny, whether it's light application of labor and environmental regulations. So the stock market could go up a lot, or on trend go up a lot, even if the economy as a whole is doing badly or being badly served. Whereas the bond market, in the end, is something that all governments, including autocrats, have to deal with. I mean, we saw this with Erdogan in Turkey recently, that he was pursuing a whole set of policies that included autocratic policies, but also bad economic policies. And it was when inflation got out of hand and the bond markets and currency markets were pushing against Turkey was when he reversed and saw his limit. Now, the issue for the US is that on any given path of debt, the US is still the US. We issue debt in our own currency. We issue the world's reserve currency. We are the most secure national security and the dominant player. And so it is very hard to pressure the US. It can happen, but it requires more force, in a sense, than other countries. We're not Greece, we're not Italy, we're not even the UK circa fall 2 years ago. And so for me, and this is why this topic that you've raised, this panel and you and David are speaking about, is so interesting, and I'm writing something about this right now, it's a breakdown in governance of fiscal policy that worries me more than the actual numbers. They're talking about adding hugely to the government deficits if they continue, and the Biden administration left us with very large deficits. So on paper, this is bad. But if the US is making the world a scary place, in the short term, if only to feed the Trump administration, but also to duck geopolitical risk, people will move money into the US. So in the short term, perversely, you're not going to have a crisis of any kind by this. But on the other hand, part of what's kept the US out of debt trouble, even as our debt accumulates, is because of the faith that the three branches, the system works in some fundamental sense. And for all of Congress's faults, every 10 to 12 years, they say, okay, the budget's gotten out of hand, let's raise some taxes, let's cut some spending. And then it goes off the rails for another 10 years, and then they have another commission or bipartisan something, and they fix it temporarily. If that ceases to be credible, that Congress will come together every so often and do something responsible, that's when I think people start to lose faith in the US government. That's when the bond market starts to really sell off, meaning interest rates rise. And that's when the pressure hits. But that's not immediate. That's something that will probably, unfortunately, take several years.
And do you
Thank
think
you.
Go ahead.
David.
No, I was just going to ask Adam whether he thinks the things that he has undertaken will make inflation worse or better.
Thank you for the straight up economics question, David, kind of you. My view is inflation is extremely likely. I expect that a year from now, we're going to have 4.5%, 5% inflation in the US, which we saw under Biden, people really don't like. I think the more uncertain part is whether that's inflation in a boom or stagflation, meaning inflation and a recession. And there are, normally you do an economic forecast and it sort of looks like a, normal hump, right? This is where we think it's going to go. It might go this way, it might go that way. I fear that because of the destabilizing policies of the Trump administration, we're in a dual mode or two hump situation. We're not going to end up in the middle. We're either going to end up with a big boom because of the tax cuts and handouts to corporates and the deregulation, some of which is genuinely helpful. And that gives you a boom, but with lots of inflation, or they overdo it in terms of shifting the tax base onto consumers, cutting off imports, getting retaliation from abroad, in which case you get the recession and still the inflation. I think inflation's pretty baked in, but the uncertainty is about how much growth we get with it.
Yeah. And isn't the problem that the growth tends to help the wealthy, but the inflation hits everybody? And that's what, especially hurt Biden, was he wasn't able to deal with inflation. And so he lost a lot of folks to Trump on they were seeing egg prices go up.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the growth actually sometimes helps the lower income people more than the wealthy. Actually, under Biden, there's an argument for that. But as Jason Furman pointed out in the most recent Foreign Affairs, unfortunately, the inflation more than offset that.
Yeah.
But I mean, going back to you, David, and I don't want to cut off questions from the audience, but can you say a bit more about why you have faith that the lower level courts matter? I mean, will the Trump administration be essentially like Andrew Jackson and say, you're telling me not to do that, but you don't have an army, I'm going to do it anyway? I mean, for a non-lawyer like me, can you explain why that's going to work?
So there's been a lot of concern about that, as you know, and probably some folks in the UK know as well, in part because J.D. Vance has raised questions about whether the president should be following the courts if they rule against him, in part because Elon Musk has said, judges who rule against him should be impeached. I think it's important to underscore that Trump has not made any such noises, and in fact has said exactly the opposite when he was questioned about this recently. He said, no, I abide by court orders. I appeal, but I abide by court orders. And so and historically, no president, and I mean no president 200 plus years, which in American history is a long time, has defied a Supreme Court order. Andrew Jackson said, was said to have said, the Marshall Court has issued that opinion, let them enforce it. But there wasn't a situation where he was required to do something and he objected. It was more a rhetorical objection to the merits of the decision. So no one has ever done that. And I think that's a very, very powerful norm. And this administration has violated a lot of norms, but that one is one that I think is a real red line. And if they were to violate it, I think you would see massive, massive protests. I mean, look at Israel. Look at what happened in Israel when they were, threatening to challenge the independence of the courts, and there were, mass protests of hundreds of thousands of people, all, weekend after weekend, and I don't think it's unique to Israel. FDR, I mentioned earlier that there was a period where he was losing in the courts all the time. He was a very popular president. It was at a time of great economic privation, the Depression. He was seeking to respond in ways that people wanted him to respond, and the Supreme Court was striking down every piece of legislation that was protecting workers and consumers against business. And so he suggested, let me pack the courts. And and he was unable to pack the courts, right? Because it was so against the norm of independent courts, even though we didn't like what the courts were doing, and even though we liked what FDR was doing, and even though it was a depression, people did not go along with pack the courts. So I think the greater risk is that this Supreme Court has a fairly capacious understanding of executive power, and so they may, some of the things that he's done are unconstitutional and illegal, but some of the things he's done are probably legal. They're just stupid, cruel, and the like, and they're not going to strike those down.
David, I'm going to jump here with one question, and then we're going to come to Julie Norman and Adam. And my question is to you. A lot of people who don't follow the courts like you do assume that because both sides have packed the courts, that leads to a specific outcome. Can you give us your view on, if you were going to put a percentage on it, or maybe if you're going to give us a granular understanding, are judges across the United States of America, it will sound like a naive question, but it's a really important question for our generalist audience, which is not a legal audience for the most part. Are judges voting the party line of those presidents who put them in power, or is it more complex?
It's definitely more complicated than that, right? They are told you are supposed to apply the law, not vote like a politician. And I think for the most part they do that. And I'll give you just one data point on that, right? In the last 2 years, the Supreme Court has been 6-3, 6 Republicans, 3 Democrats. The ACLU was involved in 36 merits cases in the Supreme Court in the last 2 years. They hear about 60 cases a year. We were involved in 36, so about 25% of the cases each term, 36 for 2 terms. And these are all civil rights, civil liberties, controversial cases. We don't get into private disputes. We get into issues of major public importance. Now, if we had been advocating to a Congress that was 66% Republican and 33% Democrat, and we, filed 36 petitions, we would lose every single one of them, right? Before this Supreme Court, of those 36 cases, the court sided with the ACLU, with the ACLU's position, 24 of the 36 cases, and against us in 12. Now, numbers don't tell the whole picture because, a case like Dobbs overturning the right to abortion is worth, 15 victories on the other side. But it's just some indication that the judges are not acting like total politicians. They are trying to apply the law. They're thinking about the broader consequences. They're not simply voting party line. And that's absolutely critical to their legitimacy, to their role in our system.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer a huge amount. And it accords with my views, but I can tell you that it is not the headline that comes out most often about the court requests. For Adam and for David, I want to turn to a few questions in the audience, and I'm going to let Tom lead on rallying our audience to the questions. I believe, Tom, you've got Julie first. Is that correct?
Yes, we should have Julie here. Yeah. Yes, hi. Thank you both so much for your comments. I mean, I'm wondering just if you can say a little bit more how public pressure, civil society kind of efforts play into some of the pushback to some things that Trump is doing. Will that make a difference? Do Democrats have any kind of strategy? What do you see in kind of that space?
So, it depends, right? Certainly, if you're trying to do anything legislatively. Last time around, Trump had a Republican majorities in both the House and the Senate, and he wanted to do one thing above all: repeal Obamacare. He tried 14 times to repeal Obamacare. Every time he failed, even though he had majorities in both houses. Why was that? Because it was very unpopular to repeal Obamacare. That's our anemic version of health insurance. It was very unpopular, and so people went to town meetings with their legislators and said, "You cannot vote in favor of this." And when you have a majority that is a very small majority, you are basically, limited by the most moderate members of your majority, because if you lose 2 or 3 or 4 members, you've lost. So I think to the extent he's trying to do anything through legislation, that is political pressure makes a huge difference. The members are very attentive to who's calling them, what questions they have to answer when they go home on the weekends for town meetings and the like. But I think more broadly, if the country was just seen as sitting back and letting Trump do what he's doing, then it's a big ask to ask the Supreme Court to step up and on its own stop him, and courts as well. But if there's substantial opposition and resistance in the press, in the academy, from religious leaders, from people within the Republican Party as well as outside the Republican Party, from civil society organizations like the ACLU or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the leading African American group, or the unions, right? All of that, that's how civil society works. That's the way our democracy works. It doesn't work just at the ballot, but although it obviously does work at the ballot, but it also operates in the interim through the coordinated activities of citizens stepping up, speaking out, and they're doing that. Again, not in the kind of in the streets yet, but I think we're going to see that. Not in the streets yet, but it's not the streets. Is it looks good on TV and stuff, but it's really the more sustained civil society, organized, strategic opposition that you're seeing, that results in all these lawsuits against Trump and the like.
Adam, can I get you to weigh in on this? We tend to think about a lot of the economic interests as being diffuse. The market's a very diffuse concept. But when you listen to what David is saying, what are the examples and the set of policies that you are looking at where you might expect to see this kind of engagement, or is it just very different?
No, I think it's largely different because it is a question. It's partly a question of public opinion, and then it gets weighted in some sense by the amount of money involved. So I'll give 2 examples. So some of you may be aware, there have been calls, particularly from the Black churches, to do boycotts of a number of the major retailers who discarded their DEI and minority purchasing programs as soon as Trump changed the tone. And as discussions of sanctions in the economic sphere would say, it's much better if you're more effective if you target and limit. So, for example, pick Target or Amazon and just say, we are not going to buy from them for the next period. And the Christian right in the US has done that sort of thing. And it may work, it may not work, but it is a much more effective thing than to talk about historically general strikes, one day of not purchasing, more symbolic acts. In economics, it's more about the bottom line. And so it's more effective to pick your targets, go after them hard, and then proceed. I mean, this is just, I'm not recommending it. I'm just saying it's a statement of fact. Another thing, though, is just to pick up what the Biden experience showed us, and the constant discussion of eggs shows us, is that, and Lenin said this, Marx said this, but also Milton Friedman said this, inflation is about the most corrosive thing politically that exists. And for former central bankers like me, I occasionally I'm gobsmacked how much people get upset with inflation in, the mid-single digits. On my econometrics, on my history, that's not the end of the world. It's not good, but it's not, there's no particular obvious economic reason why it should be as triggering as it is. Now, the flip side of this, which I have no expertise on, is how much does the partisan polarization warp this? So many people are familiar, and there's very good evidence that in the US right now, people's perceptions of the economy, including just straightforward things like what's growth, what's inflation, are massively affected by which party they affiliate with or see themselves as. And this is much bigger than it's ever been, at least in decades of polling data. And so maybe you get inflation, but Trump's able to tell his base it was Biden's fault, or it's the foreigners' fault, or it's going away. So you have these two competing things. But if you want to pick one thing that's likely to undermine support for policy, a government, it's inflation.
Thank you. And presumably it's inflation, but still filtered through the electoral mechanism. In other words, the ballot box, as opposed to anything more immediate.
Well, no, I think there it becomes, again, subject to the disinformation issues, what David was saying. Do you create a climate in the media, in the academy, in the courts, in influencers, in certain civil society organizations that says this is really bad? So it's not just the ballot box.
Right. Okay. No, thank you for that. We're going to come, Tom, again, I'll leave it to you to handle Duff and then Max. Duff Mitchell and then Max Yoeli.
Yes, hello. Duff Mitchell here. I'm speaking to you from Canada, where we're waiting for economic warfare with the United States to start sometime soon. My question is, how can civil society in the United States push back if Trump, in effect, changes the system of U.S. government by ignoring both Congress's Impunity Act, or no, it's Impoundment Act, sorry, I typo there, Congress's Impoundment Act, and the court's enforcement of court rulings, while relying almost totally on the Supreme Court's support for expansive executive immunity powers?
Maybe we'll go ahead and take that one first, because it is a big one. Who would like to come in?
Well, I think if the courts give, if the president ignores or violates congressional statutes, the way to check that is through the courts. If the courts allow him to do that, then separation of powers has failed. But I don't, see evidence yet that that's the case. Many courts have already ruled against him. The Supreme Court has ruled against him in the two most recent instances that have come up before him. They're not the core yet. The last time around the court ruled against him, it was still a majority Republican court, including his own appointees ruled against him on a number of cases last time around. So I just wouldn't, if we go to a point where neither the Congress nor the court checks the president, then we're in a Viktor Orban situation. But I don't think we'll get there. I think we have much more robust civil society institutions. We have a very strong history of the independence of the court. And so, and I don't think people are all that happy with what Trump is doing. So it won't happen immediately, right? We're in the first month. Things, in the internet age, we sort of expect things to happen immediately. It's easy to issue an executive order, but to actually make it work, you have to run it through all these legal challenges. So I'm going to resist the hypothetical.
Thank you, David. Clearly, you're going to have to start writing a lot more in the UK press. Adam.
I defer to David. What he said makes sense to me on that.
We'll come to Max. I have a feeling this is going to be a question for you, Adam. Max Yoeli.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you, Adam and David, for doing this. It's actually a question that would, I think, bring your worlds together and that is thinking about the independence of the Federal Reserve. So with the administration's push to undermine agency independence, many see that eventually heading to the Supreme Court. And I guess, in some of the executive orders, we've seen an effort to carve out the Fed's monetary policy role as separate and different from other independent agency functions. And I wonder whether, David, you think there's a realistic legal argument to be made that executive authority can extend over all other independent agencies except that capacity. And then Adam, were the court to decide that independent agencies are subject to the administration and to oversight in that way, what do you think the market reaction would be to a more politicized Fed? And do you think that might ultimately serve as a constraint?
I can probably go first because I think I can be brief. In terms of the Fed specifically, I think this fits into the category David was talking about earlier, that it's not outright illegal. It's a stretchy interpretation. It's probably a bad idea, where I'm saying what you put out there, Max, about limiting independence to monetary policy decisions. And we saw that in the forced resignation of the vice chair for banking supervision. Again, I think it's a bad idea from a policymaking point of view, but I don't think it's in any way illegal. And to varying degrees with the other economic regulators and agencies, I think that's the extent of it. It's going to lead less so at the Fed, more at other agencies, to corruption, de facto and direct. It's going to lead to political favoritism. It's going to lead to more politicized, less consistent decisions, which we've seen from evidence across countries over time, tends to reduce investment, tends to reduce the productivity of investment, tends to reduce the attractiveness of the country as a place for investment. On the inflation front, the Federal Reserve, this is one place where I sound more like David on the courts. There's a long tradition, with the exception of Arthur Burns under the Nixon administration, of the Federal Reserve standing up to the president, and more importantly, the Senate, and for that matter, even the president, usually seeing this as a good thing, that they can scapegoat the Federal Reserve for taking care of inflation, but the Federal Reserve does it. So I still think that's the most likely outcome, but I do think the Fed's already is going to just fall further and further behind the curve if we get the kind of inflation I'm talking about, and that they will probably err on the side of easing in the face if it's stagflation, which is not necessarily the right thing to do. So I think they'll make some less good decisions in the short term, which will add a little bit to interest rates and add a little bit to the pain of the process of getting rid of inflation. But fundamentally, I expect that the Fed's independence of monetary policy will remain. Oh, and a very good column by Chris Giles in the FT yesterday, citing Dan Tarullo, a law professor at Harvard, who used to be vice chair of the Fed.
Thank you for that, Adam. David?
Yeah, I think the constitutional issue is whether you can have agencies that are executive agencies that have some independence from the president. And there are many members of the conservative members of the court who think the executive branch has to be controlled by the president, and so he has to be able to have the power to remove anyone in the executive branch who is not doing his bidding. And so they have struck down a number of different mechanisms to try to provide some independence to various actors within the executive branch, which is a huge, branch at this point, and where in some instances you really do need independence. The one thing that sort of everybody thinks will check them in going all the way is the Fed, because like Adam said, everybody kind of thinks, I think pretty much everyone thinks it's important for the Fed to be independent. And so that, I think, will put a check on how far the court will go in this view it has that the president has to be able to remove every member of the executive branch whenever he wants to. The case law at the moment is that for multi-member boards like the Fed, you can actually have some independent requirement that limits the president's ability to restrict, to remove, but that's very much under attack by various conservatives. I don't think they want to see the Fed politicized. So how they justify that, I don't think it'll be a Fed only rule. I think that will constrain how far they go with the more general rule, but we'll see.
So as we come to a close, I want to say one thing and ask you one question, just to give you each a moment to sort of give a brief concluding remark. And I guess, my comment is that this is an unusual session for us, not only because we have had a very bad storm and therefore bad Wi-Fi. As you know, David, and I'm sure Adam, having lived in the UK, that when the weather is bad, everything kind of is different. The tubes, the taxis, and also the Wi-Fi. But with that said, we normally at Chatham House focus our conversations on foreign policy. In the current moment, especially when it comes to looking at the US. But in the current moment, because there is so much concern with America's engagement in Europe and across the globe in multilateral institutions on questions of security, obviously on the tariffs and broader economic policy, a lot of us, including those who are more expert on foreign policy, are looking deep inside of America to try and understand things that we're really very not non-expert on. So we are incredibly appreciative of your willingness to bring your expertise to a different audience, and we hope that you will continue to engage with us and with the UK audiences in our ecosystem. It's incredibly important right now, because otherwise we do get, and I don't mean this to be judgmental of those of us in the UK, but we do get some banalities that kind of get circulated because the expertise simply isn't here on the issues that both of you are so deeply expert on. In closing, could you each say just a few words on what you are watching for right now? And you've sort of said it in a general way, but maybe in the short term, in the weeks ahead, what are you watching for? And because it will help us maybe channel some of our watching strategies as well. And maybe I'll start with you, David, and then let you close, Adam.
Oh, that's the challenge is that he has the initiative, right? So he decides what we are looking at, because he'll do something new every day. So it feels very overwhelming, I think, for many people right now. But I will be watching how these many cases that have been filed proceed, how the Supreme Court responds when they reach them, initially on kind of emergency stay requests and the things, not on the merits for probably till next year, but those will be signs, and signs of growing opposition, growing resistance taking hold in the country, and I think that's absolutely critical.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you for having us, Leslie, and for giving us this forum for a new audience. I'm watching, I'll just rattle them off, 5 things. First, there's going to be an announcement supposedly at the start of April of what the tariff policy is, what this reciprocal trade policy means, that if there's content to that, it matters. Second, very important, not just in human rights terms, frankly, but also economic terms, is the blockage of migration into our labor markets and potential deportation. So far, the deportations have been a fraction of what they proposed to do and a fraction of what Obama did. So it remains to be seen. If they up that significantly beyond the human costs, the economic costs are very high. Third, the budget, as I may have tried to indicate, in a sense, from a procedural perspective, even if I don't like the outcome, the budget process has held. It was Congress doing what they chose to do, and it wasn't exactly what the president has done, and they have not yet allowed directly the restrictions of disbursements that the president seems to want to do. That will become a legal issue, and I'll be watching that carefully. Fourth is how much the US-China relationship becomes a deal versus escalating into other foreign policy spheres. That's been in abeyance, and in a sense, it's good news if US-China sort of left on the back burner. And then the final point, going back to the Fed, is essentially the macro forecast. Are we going to end up in a stagflationary scenario or an inflation scenario, or if I'm totally wrong, a relatively benign scenario? I think that benign scenario depends on some deus ex machina from AI, basically, some kind of productivity miracle, which may happen. Can't rule it out. But I think that's the only get out of jail free card to avoid inflation.
Tremendous. This has been very, very helpful, very insightful. Thank you so much to both you, David Cole, and you, Adam Posen, for sharing your insights. I encourage everybody to read your work, because your work, both of you, is extraordinary. And I encourage both of you to continue to publish in the UK press, so that people have that heightened and highly informed level of engagement from Washington. It couldn't be more important right now for having a measured conversation about where we are and where we're headed.